Hi, welcome to Moving to a New Place, a podcast on race, faith, and all things in between. My name is Dalton Holloway. Also on the podcast, Mike Linnon. Team Eggnog. In this final episode, Mike and Dalton take a minute to reflect on the lessons that they've learned together as friends. So we're here. This is our last one. Not for lack of content. You could go on about this forever.
For sure.
But this is a good stop for us. And I think personally that we've spoken into it as much as we need to. Honestly. I'm still trying to find another place where I can hear this kind of discourse. And I haven't found it. And I'm going to say that, Mike, this was good. I think we filled an area that hasn't really been forayed in this whole conversation about race and faith. So for that reason, I'm glad we did this.
Yeah, for sure. Me too. I've enjoyed it immensely, and I feel like it is just the beginning in a sense that I hope that we could have conversations like this with other people too. But the bonus, the start, was the fact that we had a basis from which we felt we could dive into this and not feel defensive about it and be able to talk about it. So, but yeah, so we want to take turns going from the lessons learned over the last little while that we've been doing these podcasts together.
Takeaways. So take it away, Mike.
Okay.
Start it up.
So my first top lesson, if we're going to do a top 3 or top 4 or whatever, my top lesson would definitely be the value of listening. And for me, that's not just listening randomly, like to everybody's opinions. I actually get kind of stressed as I read a whole bunch of opinions about a given thing. It seems to not be that helpful. But stories, man, I found stories extremely impactful. So hearing the stories of yourself, other people, talking about what it was like to be mistreated, made to feel inferior, and just the setting of it, what age they were, and what was the context, and all those things helped me appreciate so much more. It doesn't mean I understood what they had gone through, but I understood better than I had before. And their vulnerability in sharing their story, that was always that was a good thing because that their journey's being valued, but also I just think that it helps me cross further than just a series of propositions about what racism is and what you should and shouldn't do.
Right.
But when you hear someone's story, you want to make room for them in the world. You want them to feel valued. You want them to feel loved. And so I think listening helped me appreciate things beyond just statements about equality or statements about theology or statements about what the church should or shouldn't be doing. I think more stories is better. And Ray said something in our conversation with him about listening being the first step towards action. Yeah. It starts with you got to back it up and you got to hear stories first.
My top one is that we, as a collective, when it comes to race groups, I guess, just in light of our podcast, that we're not all the same. We're all on a continuum in regards to race relations globally, really, but for our sake, this context. So you talk about story. So I shared a little bit of my mom's story with the crew who've been listening. And her response, if you remember, that's not necessarily the blanket response for everyone who's black. Some internalize it, and it can sometimes come out in different ways, sometimes at home, sometimes it gets bottled up. But one of the takeaways is that we're all taking in this information and we're all taking in these experiences differently. One of my friends who's melanin rich. He's decided to get some counseling and to talk through, his life and his cross points when it comes to race and things that have been spoken to him based on that. Others, for me, I guess in a way, this is a type of therapy for me in a way, I think, to talk things through in this forum and to have you, Mike, as my friend to talk it through and with the listeners as well. But certainly for me, and hopefully for the listeners too, to recognize that everyone who's in this story is at a different place. We're not all at the place where we can say, you know what, high resilience, right? Someone says, like my mother, not everyone is like my mom, where someone says something racist and she just quips. Some, it's different, it comes out differently.
This is almost a twist on it, because my second thing, and this isn't something that I would say is like this happy lesson that's tied up in a bow. Just like listening is like, okay, it leads to an ongoing action, I hope. Mm-hmm. And I think we should be thinking, as we think about these, what is this going to mean for the future? Yeah. Like what going forward might it change? And that is but I don't understand how to even phrase this, but how people lump whole groups, make assumptions about whole groups based on how someone behaved to them. So I'm using the word representativeness, but I don't think that that's probably a legit term, or maybe it applies to something else that I don't know, so I better pull off of that. But anyways, the idea that, do I represent all white people to somebody? Do you represent all black people to somebody? Or when they see you, they see some other experience. So therefore you are now this other person or experience that they had. It's just dangerous to make assumptions about people and their group. And that's not healthy. That's not a healthy way to go forward, is to say you represent all people. Because I can't represent my kind, my type. There isn't one type. There isn't a bunch of, like a monolithic group of people like me. There's a whole pile of very different people who believe differently, who behave differently all over the world. And I have to do the very best at treating people equally and kindly and in the way that Christ would call me to. And knowing that, sometimes I'm going to have to overcome a stereotype about me in some context. But I can't serve that context. I have to be aware of it, but I still have to go towards that goal with some level of confidence and do the best I can and stumble forward and not worry too much about, do I represent somebody else's, thing that they've done, kind of thing. Whether, so I don't know.
It almost speaks to what I just previously said, where you're saying that you don't want to be representative to someone else, and maybe that person might not even necessarily see you as that, depending on their experience, right? So if someone experiences, racism on a systemic level, it's not necessarily you are representative of all of those things.
Yeah.
That's a deeper thing that needs to be dealt with. That's a deeper war. But for you to come in and say, I'm just going to be who I am, that's all that there is to it. They're not going to necessarily know your heart and your intent. Like the story you talked about the gentleman who was in his car and you said hi to him and he freaked out, right?
Yeah.
There's nothing that you could have done differently in hindsight, that would have changed that outcome.
Yeah.
You are just being who you are in your identity.
Yeah.
As a neighbor, as a person who's desiring to get to know, step out of your comfort zone. And then for him, his reaction was, you are this. Well, that's his experience has formed him to make that response, but that's not you doing anything wrong.
That's a great example, because I'm intentionally trying to be a friendly neighbor at that stage, walking past this guy's house. and he's assuming that I think he's trying to steal something
And those
because of
fathers
the
from
color
here-
of his skin.
Yeah.
And I hadn't even, like, it hadn't even, I'm like, I'm trying to get his attention to say hi. Like, I felt like I'm Ned Flanders, right? I'm like, hi, you know, like, but I'm like, I want to be friendly, you know? And so, yeah, you're right. You have to be fully present. And you have to, in a sense, be relentlessly, and maybe it will take many times of kindness or attempts to break through, but maybe that would be required in some context. Maybe because of what his experience is, trust will never be given easily.
And you can put that on anything, not necessarily just race, right?
Right.
Put that on
Yeah.
being a father or a mother, like
Pastor.
or pastor.
Someone's had a bad experience
Exactly.
at church,
Then
so
all
now
of a
I
sudden,
represent
you're representing
all of their
of
bad
them.
experiences. Yeah, exactly.
And that's not necessarily fair to
Right.
do. So
I just find that the dialogue sometimes tends towards that representativeness, and I just think we have to be careful.
I am more aware of how much God plays on the side of civil rights. We read a book, I'll tell everyone now, we read a book called Color of Compromise by Jamar Tisby. And we're going to post it as a podcast, but we were in a room and it was really loud outside. And there was some movement and some traffic, and unfortunately it was just too much to put out there. But I think reading his book helped frame this takeaway for me. So you should read the book if you haven't read it. But ultimately, one of the takeaways from the book is that the classic, trope that people do talk about when it comes to the propagation of church and the gospel to blacks in the American context. I mean, the slave context has always been, we take this book and we hit you over the head with it and we subjugate you with it. And, the white Jesus picture is there in your place to remind you all these things. But when blacks started to read the book, they wised up to some stories in there, specifically the story of Exodus and Moses and the Promised Land, and that story is very much a bedrock of the black church tradition, for sure. And that's kind of the foundation of what we have as civil rights. And when you historically read about many of the black congregations that were founded, one of their pillars were, we aren't slaves. The subjugation in which we are being put under by our masters is in effect against the will of God, and we are going to never claim this, and we are going to continue to fight it and bring it all the way to the 60s with this pastor named Martin Luther King Jr., who's lauded and praised and Nobel Peace Prize and all that sort of thing. So a takeaway for me was that it's when the black church took that, they were able to say, we hear what you're saying, masters, but our read of it says this.
Yeah.
And that is what kind of propels things. And I know that there are some who are Christian who might have some reservations or some hesitation when it comes to civil rights, especially based on 2020 and Black Lives Matter, and there's all these movements and all these stories about things that have been done right and all that sort of thing, and that has sometimes led them to think that there's a negative slant, and everyone will use anything to push their own agenda, Trojan horse sort of deal. But at the foundation of it, like civil rights it's God's work, and I think that is something that I didn't recognize previously to us starting this. I was very much like, I did feel that. People did say it, family members who were in my family said, they use this book to slave us, and there's some merit to it, but they also took that same book and upended it and put it in your face and said, no, this isn't it. So that for me is a takeaway.
For sure. I'll add to that because I thought that was one of the great takeaways from Tisby's book. And I also recommend it, The Color of Compromise. is the resilience, and obviously he just scraped the surface of the incredible, the preaching and the teaching and the singing and the music, the understanding of the gospel by Black Christians in the midst of mistreatment, in the midst of all that they went through, that they could see through the injustice and didn't just reject it all as, this is somebody else's religion or somebody else's faith. No, there was a living encounter with God, and
Absolutely.
it just seems to me that it's like a hearing the voice of another people's experience in their journey with Jesus, in their following of him, is a crucial thing, a crucial way to help me get out of the narrow ways that I can easily fall in, that are actually cultural, not biblical, or really being shaped by faith. Areas that I may just be assuming are fine, and yet they're yet to be transformed by the power of Jesus in me. So when I'm in contact with another culture, and I remember when I got to spend some time in Africa, that jars you. It causes you to take questions, and it's the beauty of someone else's fellowship with God. Their testimony really is powerful. So third one for me would be that this intentional talking about the impact of the gospel on how people treat one another today, like in our time. So we're talking about the scriptures and the life of Jesus that we have that in many ways reflect things that are ancient, and then we're trying to apply them to what we're going through today. I just realized that because you and I were talking about it, and I was listening to your experience, and we were trying to figure some things out, that then as I was studying scriptures, I would see things that I would say, I would have noticed those before, but now I'm going to make sure I point them out. So if I'm teaching on something and there's a passage there that just talks about the universality of the gospel, it's for all people, that there's a correlation. For all people means there's a gift here that's meant for everyone. Like the access is meant to be equal for all people. That's just one example. I was going through the genealogy of Jesus in Advent, and from the Gospel of Matthew. And as we talked about how the uniqueness of God using one people group, the Jewish people, the children of Abraham, a promise that through them would come a gift for all nations. On one hand, you say, well, it's very beautiful that one group was chosen, but then the one group was chosen to bless all the other groups. That means that all of them are important in the sight of God. And just for that by itself, just to reflect on that, there's a beautiful thing to that. I enjoyed thinking about that, praying about it, and then teaching on that. And I don't know that I would have made the point if we hadn't been talking and realizing the issues that people are facing. I would have assumed, no one else would really question that. But so there's that. Of course, the great passages like in Ephesians chapter 2 and Revelation, all the nations. I was in teaching through the book of Daniel, and Daniel chapter 7 talks about this one like the Son of Man who all of the nations would honor. And again, this is just this idea of all peoples is something that we need to point out. By the way, that does mean all people. Like you can put actual people from your world into that picture. And there's a lot of hope there, and there's a lot of aspiration, and it keeps, I think, a light ahead of the tunnel in the difficult places to say that's where we're headed, that's where we should be headed, to keep that as a goal for us as Christians. So what I'm saying is our talking about it made me see new things and make me want to apply them better and not just assume everyone knows about that.
Right.
I realized, no, not everyone knows about that. What's happening in the world is because we don't realize that the wall of hostility has come down between peoples and between nations, and that's the very purpose of God.
My third has to do with our conversation with Ray. And he was talking about how sometimes, most of the time, Christians, when they talk about land, they talk about the promised land and kind of traversing, but doesn't talk about this land. And ever since we had that podcast, that this land has been just bouncing all over my brain, like in everything. It's like, what is going on here? So our context, Mike and I were in South Ottawa, pretty much. And we have been shaped, and this whole podcast thing came through after the killing of George Floyd. But now I'm asking the question, like, what is happening here? Mm-hmm. We've talked with Ray, and it is very clear, and I think our country, Canada's done a pretty good job of letting people know about the story of the Indigenous and their interaction with the government and some of the atrocities that happened in that relationship. That being said, there is also a whole other narrative about British blacks, those who came up through the Underground Railroad from America and settled here in Canada. And now I want to know more about what's going on here. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about atrocities that are going on in Minnesota, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, these stories, they hit, but there's still those laws that get changed don't really affect me in Ottawa. It's obviously good to see, and it's not taken away from the hurt. It's not taken away from the struggle. It doesn't take away from what needs to be changed. But what's going on in my neck of the woods? Like, what's going on here in Canada? What's going on here in Ottawa? I can look at law enforcement in Tampa. I can look at law enforcement in Nashville. What's going on in law enforcement in Toronto? What's going on in Ottawa? What's going on in Winnipeg? I can talk about the stories of slavery. I can talk about what happened in the South. But what happened to those first blacks who settled in Canada and Southern Ontario? Mm-hmm. You know, what's the story of Africville? What's the story of Halifax? What's the story of Southern Ontario? What are those stories out there that we as Canadians don't know about? And I've done some research since we started this podcast, and it's not like the stories aren't there. Like, the information is all, if you want to find out about anything, you can find it. It's not hidden. Yeah. But we need to be able to own the story of this land in Canada and retell those stories so that we can know more about what's going on here and not stop full.
Right.
Know what's going on, but own our own stories. And these stories of change and civil rights and turning the dial on things here in this country happens when we know about what's going on in this country. So that's the takeaway for me is I pay too much attention to what's goes on in America. It's pretty much the takeaway is I'm too Americanized. I want to admit it. Yeah. And I need to pull back and know what the Canadian story is. Yeah.
All of these things that we've learned, especially, I would say for sure, I shouldn't speak for you, but I speak for me, the things that I've gained in this last little while that we've been doing this have partly come about, or mostly come about, because we have a baseline of understanding between us that long precedes the conversation. So you and I didn't walk in as strangers. We've had a long journey as friends, and, you know, at different seasons of life, it's been more like family, right? So I think that what that did is it made I was more able to maybe make a mistake and more able to try to express my thoughts and not think that if I said the wrong thing, I was out, you know. There was this space that was given, and I feel like this whole idea of moving to a new place, that the possibility of someone changing their views, if that's actually the goal, there's something about the room or the space that's given. I'll use the word friendship. I've realized since we started that some people have used the idea of friendship in a sort of like, a negative way, like, you know, friendship's not going to take us very far. And I think what they mean is someone's sort of defaulting to, well, they have friends of people who are different race, so therefore, they're good.
I have black friends.
Right, yeah, yeah. So that's not what I mean, and that would never be what I meant, but I realize some people might have that default position. And then what happens, of course, in this world of counter reactions, then friendship is made fun of as a solution. It's this terrible idea, and it's like, no, wait a second. The reality is, and I'll refer to Barack Obama, who's recently making these kinds of points, is saying if you really want to change someone's view, you need to engage with them. You need to give them the space to express their thoughts, even to express the thoughts that are off base, or maybe reveal something that they didn't even realize. And if they have the space that they know that the relationship is not going to be destroyed by them expressing it, then they've got the room to stumble towards some common areas of potential solutions and even changes in how they view and then how they're going to behave. And so, the fancy word that to draw something from, the word that I think of as covenant, where you have a relationship that's deeper than just a contract, where, as long as you're saying this and I'm saying this relationship can continue. But as soon as someone steps out of it, boom, that's over. I can't even, or you're done, you're dead to me, or whatever. That kind of language is,
You're dead to me.
yeah, and that whole thing allows nobody to grow. It polarizes. It makes the world less just. Even though, and I'm not saying we don't call each other out, I think that's part of what covenant allows. Covenant allows grace so that you can call me on stuff. And when you're calling me on it, I know it's not the end of the relationship. It's actually part of the relationship.
Right.
So then I'm able to step into that, and I can even argue with you or whatever. Not that it's not really the usual posture, but it could happen. But the relationship is going to be strong enough to go through that experience and inevitably to come out stronger. And so that idea of knowing that safety's there, that, I can even get it wrong here. I can even ask a question that's going to be, it's the best way I can think to ask it, but it betrays my, my lack of understanding right off the bat.
Yeah.
But until I get it out there, how am I going to move to a new place? I got this question. So then by you making space for me, or you saying something about where I'm coming from, and I realize, that's what he thinks. And I can correct it. I can say, that's not what I'm thinking. But because of that relationship, I really feel like it's not the secret to all things, but I think in the everyday life of living in the same community together, of going to work together, of having, classes together with people who are different from us, whether it's black or white or Indigenous or New Canadian or all the different ways in which we would feel like we're in groups. If we eagerly enter into those kinds of relationships, we give space to each other to talk about these things. There's just so much more potential for long-term difference. And the added bonus of that, and I was just thinking about that recently, the added bonus of that is even while we're arguing or talking or just eating or just doing work together or whatever it is, someone else is witnessing a deeper friendship. Someone else is seeing that. So when my kids see our friendship, then it becomes more normal for them. Now, maybe it would have been anyways, but I like to think that that's just part of the environment that was a healthy one for them to grow. And the more they see those kinds of relationships where, you can even weep together or suffer together or argue, but you're in it together. I mean, that's the community I think younger people, they want to be a part of. And I often think that, just as a pastor speaking about churches, I feel like churches have way underestimated the power that's released and the beauty that's put on display for people who may not understand church or, suspicious of it or whatever. If we're they to walk in on relationships that are very multicultural, or I don't even know what to use the right word for, but just people who are very different in background but are treating each other really well. That becomes the norm. That's an environment, I think, that people, it will make them curious. It'll make them wonder, what's that? And it makes me want to press into it all the more. And I think this whole idea of moving to a new place, whether people are religious or not, whether they know who Jesus is or not, I still think that it's still a great example of the kind of community that he intends to form on the earth, for me to bring that into whatever environment it is and create spaces. So if someone's very different from me, I need to press into it and give them room, give them that dignity to speak and tell their story. And hopefully I can grow too, because others offer it to me. And I know it's a gift to expect it, right? Especially if I represent, like I was saying, to the idea of representativeness. If I represent something horrible, is someone going to be able to trust me to talk about those type of issues? Because I could wound them, right, by asking the question wrong or whatever. There's a risk there, and I realize that. I don't think it's easy. You know, I'm not saying, why doesn't everyone just get along? I do think it's hard. But by the same token, that means, too, that I have to be willing to learn. And I really think that there's no other way forward. Otherwise, we will stay in groups. And I think that's really tragic.
We are in a time of COVID, and we've talked about social media already, and we talked about algorithms, and the social dilemma already came out. So we already know that if someone has a position and they're trying to find anything that might be counter to their position, they're probably not going to find it in our time. So it really is an effort that one has to make to really, if you really want to do it, you're going to be uncomfortable with it. I know that in, I guess, the history of music at least, more modern music, it's one of those places, and sport as well, from America, again, all eyes on America, that's where you saw more of that mixing of black and white.
Yeah.
And I think that occurs, and again, some of it was with, greedy intent and financial intent. But if you strip all that away, it's let me take in a bit of what you have and let me just take it in and not bring anything to it. Let me look at it and see it. And there's a vulnerability to do that with someone, right? If I have a culture and I know where you're at and I don't want to offend or this and that, but if you say, I want to know, I want to know, and you lay it out there, then you learn something about that other person that you otherwise would not have known. And there are things that you glean, and it just becomes this passing off of good and passing off of that aspect of you and me understanding you a bit more. But it does take that first step of trust, first off, because people don't trust easily and don't want to put themselves out there.
Yeah.
But if you find that friendship or if you find that place, then you're better off for it, because polarization is certainly a thing right now in our time.
Yeah.
That is very real.
Yeah.
And like you said, it can lead to very damaging things.
Yeah.
And when I think about sport and when I think about music, I also believe that the church should also be, in my mind, one of those, another place where that should be fostered. And unfortunately, through history, especially the American history, we've seen it's, at 11 o'clock, the most divided hour in America, that's been thrown out there. Is there a way to take that back?
Yeah.
Is there a way? Because that would be more in line and consistent with the Jesus that we've learned about and we've been studying about.
But I think you're right. I think the full tragedy of that needs to be appreciated. But then I also think that there is something going on. I don't think you and I are the only ones that are friends that can talk about this kind of thing. I think that maybe lots of folks don't even just realize what they have. and those places where those friendships can grow and they can talk about these things without someone trying to dominate and convince the other of their perspective, but to try and understand each other. And yeah, maybe there's some persuasion going on there, I think, but that some healthy persuasion is good. I bet you there's lots of where it's close, where people, these kind of things should be allowed to happen, and they just need to be encouraged to have those conversations.
Yeah.
Because I think it's, I think that in terms, at least in the Christian world, I think that multi-ethnic environments are growing. We're getting better at appreciating how beautiful that can be. There's still a long ways to go. The formats and the structures are still are from a prior time. So to really invite people to play to be who they are in those contexts is still going to take a lot of work. But I still think that position, though it's a moderate position, right? It's not taking a radical on one side or other. And I think that's what's going to make it radical, because it may all wash over. I don't know. I don't know if media and all this stuff is going to kind of hit a point where people are going to feel tired of extreme positions and proving someone's right and wrong and canceling each other. I don't know. I'm hoping that it all I hope it's a thing that we, 20 years from now, I go, remember when everyone was just like, I'm done with you? Yeah. But I don't know. But at least in the meantime, I think it's going to be a radical position to truly be loving to both sides, and to be a moderate will mean you might get shot at. And I don't mean moderate in caring for, being equal with other people and caring for the issues of racism and striving to be anti-racist. But you may be considered moderate by truly listening to and being friends with people who have radical positions, and yet not identifying yourself as just, waving a sword for one side or the other. I think that's going to be radical, but I think it's necessary. And I think it's the thing that will help people actually move to a new place. Because I don't think that those extreme positions, they both kind of go to a place of burn it all down. And you just never can. They both exist. They both will continue to exist.
Yeah.
So we have to strive for this, for
You're
more of this.
getting a little prophetic there by saying the moderate. I think when you say moderate, the image that comes to mind is a bridge.
Right. Yes.
That's what comes to mind.
Yeah, I think you're right.
So maybe the future of this, as we, close this chapter of moving to a new place, that maybe it's the role, or will be the role, of those who choose to take on that mantle, is to be bridge builders. If the polarization gets too bad.
It's already bad. We have to be bridge builders.
There it is. Okay. There we go.
Well said.
Well said. Thanks for doing this. And that was the last episode of Moving to a New Place. For us, this is just the beginning of learning and unlearning, and we hope the same is true for you. A few acknowledgements. To Mike, thanks for calling me in July to check in on me. This podcast would never have materialized had you not done that. Thank you for your love and concern and friendship, and I'm glad that we can journey together in this. To Nick Lennon, for the amazing visual, you have a great eye for composition. The McKendrys, for lending us that old pew that we could use. To Ben Dion, for lending me pretty much half of the equipment I needed to do this podcast. I appreciate it. The Blue Yeti is going to stay with me forever. You are not getting it back. To Barabal and Pold, I'll probably never meet you, but thanks for making the track Lockdown. Really helped give us a nice flow for the podcast. To Dr. Ray Aldred, your words and wisdom were invaluable to this podcast. Thank you so much. And to the listener, for journeying with us. We appreciate your ears. If you know anyone who's looking for a different approach and conversation when it comes to race and faith, feel free to tell them about us. And finally, remember, if you're trying to move to a new place, listen.